For my parents' 40th anniversary, I flew 2,500 miles with a gift wrapped in thick gold paper. Before I could even set it on the table, my mother looked me up and down and said, "We did not invite you. Your sister planned this." My father pushed the box off the table and told me to take my cheap garbage and leave. I picked it up, smiled, and walked out. When they found out what was actually inside that box the next morning, I woke up to 114 missed calls and a text begging for forgiveness. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Valerie, and I am 34 years old. Walking into the VIP hall of the Belmont Country Club, I felt the familiar weight of my family judgment heavy in the air. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering floral arrangements that screamed new money and old insecurities. The Belmont was the kind of place where people pretended to have generational wealth while secretly drowning in credit card debt. I wore a simple tailored black dress. It did not have a flashy designer logo plastered across the chest, so to my mother Yolanda it was essentially a garbage bag. I had not seen my parents in 2 years. I built a life far away from their toxic obsession with status and appearances. But I came back tonight because I knew something they did not know. I knew their entire financial world was collapsing. The gold box in my hands held the only lifeline that could save them from total ruin. I barely made it past the ice sculpture when Yolanda intercepted me. She wore a sequined gown that cost more than my first car. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, making sure none of her elite church friends were watching her interact with the family disappointment. "What are you doing here, Valerie?" she hissed. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my arm, trying to physically steer me back toward the lobby doors. "I told you over the phone that this was an exclusive event for our real circle. You are going to embarrass us looking like a high school guidance counselor." I did not pull my arm away. I just looked down at her hand until she uncomfortably let go. "I came to give you an anniversary gift," I said calmly, extending the gold box. "It is something you desperately need." My father Richard stepped out from behind a towering arrangement of white roses. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and glared at me. His face was twisted in that familiar mask of disappointment he had worn since my childhood. "We did not invite you," he said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Your sister Monique planned this night to celebrate our legacy. We do not need you ruining the aesthetic with your cheap presents." I looked at the two of them and felt a cold calm wash over me. The old Valerie would have cried. The old Valerie would have begged for a seat at the table. But the woman standing in front of them owned a private equity firm that could buy this entire country club in cash. They just did not know it yet. I adjusted my grip on the box. "Funny," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You talk about aesthetics and legacy now, but I remember the exact brand of the garbage bag you handed me when you kicked me out of the house at 18. It was a hefty bag, drawstring, very practical for a girl you threw onto the street in the middle of winter just because she refused to give her 2 minimum wage paychecks to fund a down payment for Monique's new luxury car." Yolanda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, please, you are still holding on to that ancient history. You always were so dramatic and jealous of your sister. She is a success. She married a brilliant Wall Street financial expert. Look at you now. 34 years old, working some back-office bank job, and showing up here uninvited to beg for scraps from our table. You really should leave, Valerie," my father added. He took a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a teenager. "You have always been the dark cloud in this family. We are trying to enjoy a milestone. Do not make me call security and have you escorted out of here." "Security?" I asked, tilting my head. "You want to call security on your own daughter? Because she brought you a gift." "It is probably just a cheap candle or a picture frame," Yolanda sneered. "We do not want your discount store garbage." She reached out and forcefully slapped my hand. The gold box slipped from my fingers and hit the polished marble floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed just enough to make a few heads turn in our direction. My father kicked it lightly with his Italian leather shoe, pushing it toward the exit. "Take your trash and go back to whatever tiny apartment you flew in from," he said, turning his back on me. I stood there for a long moment. I let the silence stretch. I let their disrespect settle deep into my bones, cementing the decision I had made months ago. I slowly bent down and picked up the gold box. I brushed a speck of dust off the shiny paper. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey willingly walk into a cage and lock the door from the inside. "Are you absolutely sure you do not want this?" I asked one final time. "I want to be very clear. If I walk out those doors with this box tonight, your legacy is over. There will be no coming back from what happens tomorrow morning." Yolanda rolled her eyes and turned away to greet a wealthy church elder, pasting a fake glowing smile onto her face. Richard did not even look back. He just waved his hand in a shooing motion. I took a deep breath. The smell of expensive perfume and cheap morals filled my lungs. I nodded to myself. The offer of salvation was officially off the table. I turned around and walked out of the Belmont Country Club, the gold box tucked securely under my arm. The cool night air hit my face as I walked toward my waiting car. I did not feel sad. I felt liberated. Tomorrow they would lose everything, and I would be the one holding the deed to their destruction. Just as I reached the heavy glass doors of the club lobby, a sharp voice echoed across the expansive marble floor. It was Monique. She was walking in from the valet area, clinging tightly to the arm of her husband Connor. Monique was the picture of spoiled perfection. She wore a custom silk gown that I knew for a fact my parents took out a second mortgage to pay for. Her hair was perfectly styled, falling in elegant waves over her shoulders, and she carried a designer clutch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the daughter who was paraded around our community as the ultimate success story. Everything about her screamed entitlement. Beside her stood Connor. He was a tall white man with a slicked-back haircut and a smug expression that never seemed to leave his face. Connor loved to play the part of the wealthy Wall Street financial expert. From his custom-tailored suit to the flashy watch on his wrist, everything was a carefully constructed illusion. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on because he represented the elite status they so desperately craved to validate their own existence. They bragged endlessly to their friends at the country club and the church that their youngest daughter had married a financial genius. I knew the truth. Connor was a fraud running a glorified Ponzi scheme, and he had secretly forged my father's signature to use my parents' estate as collateral for a massive underground loan. "Valerie, what in the world are you doing here?" Monique snapped her eyes, darting frantically around the elegant lobby to see if any of her wealthy socialite friends were watching us. She let go of Connor's arm and marched up to me, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You were absolutely not invited to this. This is an exclusive anniversary party for Mom and Dad. We do not need you showing up in your plain clothes making us look like some charity case in front of the people who actually matter." I stopped and looked quietly at my younger sister. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sadness, just a profound sense of clinical pity. "I brought a gift for our parents," I said, simply shifting the gold-wrapped box in my hands. "I was just leaving anyway, so you do not have to worry about your carefully curated aesthetic being ruined by my presence." Connor let out a loud, arrogant laugh that bounced off the high ceilings. He stepped forward, sliding his hands casually into the pockets of his expensive suit. "Come on, Valerie," he said with a condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. "We all know why you really showed up tonight. You heard about the big promotion I lied to everyone about getting, and you figured you could squeeze your rich family for a handout. Is the rent due on whatever tiny studio apartment you are living in right now?" I stared at him, letting the silence stretch between us. The sheer unadulterated audacity of this man was almost impressive. He was drowning in a $1.2 million debt with violent creditors breathing down his neck, and yet he still had the misplaced energy to stand in a country club lobby and mock me. "I do not need your money, Connor," I replied, keeping my voice steady and unnervingly quiet. "You should probably hold on to every single penny you have. You are going to need it very soon." Connor narrowed his eyes, clearly not liking the calm authority in my tone. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek leather wallet, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. He did not hand it to me. With a theatrical sigh, he intentionally dropped the money on the polished marble floor right at my feet. "Do yourself a favor and take a cab back to the slums, Valerie," he sneered. "Buy yourself a decent hot meal and stop bothering people who actually made something of their lives." Monique giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, as if Connor had just done something incredibly charming and witty. "Just take the money and go," she said, rolling her eyes. "You are embarrassing yourself as usual." Before I could even formulate a response, I heard heavy, frantic footsteps approaching from the hallway behind me. It was my father, Richard. He and my mother, Yolanda, had followed me out to the lobby, clearly terrified that my presence near the main entrance would cause a scene in front of their arriving VIP guests. "I told you to leave," Richard hissed, grabbing my shoulder roughly and spinning me around to face him. "Are you trying to humiliate us in front of Connor's corporate colleagues? You just could not let us have one perfect night, could you?" He did not wait for an answer. His eyes locked onto the gold box I was still holding, and a look of pure, unfiltered disgust washed over his aging face. He lunged forward and swatted his large hand downward, slapping the box with such violent force that it flew completely out of my grasp. The gold package hit the hard floor, sliding across the polished marble and stopping right next to Connor's designer shoes. The sharp corner of the box crumpled slightly under the heavy impact. "We do not want anything from you," Richard growled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are not a part of this family. You are a bitter failure who resents her sisters." Beautiful success. "Get out of my sight right now before I have the security team physically drag you off the property." The sprawling lobby was completely silent now. A few wealthy guests lingering near the mahogany coat check were watching the entire scene unfold with wide, curious eyes. My mother stood a few steps behind my father, her arms crossed tightly over her sequined gown, looking at me with nothing but cold indifference. Monique and Connor stood side by side, looking down at the crumpled gold box, like it was a piece of toxic waste that had somehow washed up on their pristine shore. They all expected me to break down. They expected me to yell or cry or beg for their love and approval, just like I used to do when I was a desperate teenager seeking validation. But I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I slowly crouched down, maintaining perfect eye contact with Connor as I picked up the $100 bill he had thrown at me. I stood up, gracefully stepped into his personal space, and gently tucked the crisp bill into the breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket, smoothing the silk lapel with 2 fingers. "Use this to buy yourself a decent defense lawyer, Connor," I whispered softly so only he could hear the promise of ruin in my voice. Then I walked over to the crumpled gold box on the floor. I picked it up, dusting off the shiny paper one last time with measured precision. I walked toward a decorative mahogany console table situated near the grand entrance doors. I deliberately set the box down, placing it perfectly in the center of the table under a spotlight. I turned around and faced my toxic family one final time. My face held a chilling, calculated smile. I looked directly into my father's angry eyes, then shifted my gaze to my mother, then to Monique, and finally to Connor, whose smug expression had suddenly faltered just a fraction of an inch. "I want you to remember this exact moment," I said, my voice carrying clearly and smoothly across the quiet, luxurious lobby. "I want you to remember that I came here tonight to give you a way out, but after tonight, nothing can be undone." I did not wait for their response. I turned on my heel, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and walked out into the cool night air, leaving them behind with their arrogance, their fake wealth, and a gold box that held the only key to their imminent destruction. The valet brought my car around to the front of the club. It was a custom matte black Porsche Panamera. The valet attendant handed me the keys with a respectful nod. My family still thought I drove the beaten-up Honda Civic I bought in college because I never bothered to correct them. They preferred me poor. It made their manufactured success taste sweeter. I slid into the soft leather driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a low, powerful hum that vibrated through my chest. I merged onto the quiet highway heading back toward the city. The dashboard screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID read Aunt Brenda. I let it go straight to voicemail. Aunt Brenda was my mother's older sister and the ultimate enabler of my family's toxic behavior. She was the family gossip, the woman who appointed herself the guardian of our social standing. Less than a minute later, my car's Bluetooth system chimed, alerting me to a new audio message. I tapped the screen to play it as the dark trees blurred past my window. Valerie, I cannot believe what I just heard from your mother. Brenda's voice filled the quiet cabin of my car. Her tone was dripping with that familiar, condescending disappointment. Yolanda told me you showed up to their 40th anniversary party uninvited, looking like a homeless person and trying to start drama. When are you going to grow up and stop being so horribly jealous of your sister? Monique married a Wall Street genius. Connor is a provider. He is taking care of your parents, making sure they live the lifestyle they deserve. You are 34 years old, Valerie. It is time to stop acting like a bitter child just because you work a dead-end job and cannot afford to buy them nice things. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I kept my eyes on the road. The leather steering wheel felt cool beneath my hands. A Wall Street genius. That was the delusion my family clung to. Connor had convinced them all that his high-risk trading strategy was going to make them generational wealth. I tapped the steering wheel and instructed the car system to call Aunt Brenda back. She answered on the second ring, probably ready to yell at me some more. I am glad you called me back, Valerie, she snapped immediately. You need to drive back to that club right now and apologize to your brother-in-law. He is too important a man to be dealing with your petty tantrums. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet precision that made people lean in and listen. Aunt Brenda, I asked smoothly. When was the last time you actually talked to my father about his retirement accounts? There was a brief pause on the line. What are you talking about? Brenda demanded, her voice faltering just a fraction. Richard's retirement is perfectly fine. Connor is managing their portfolio. He is tripling their returns. Your father bragged about it at church just last Sunday. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air condition flow over me. Connor is not managing a portfolio, Brenda, I said plainly. He is running a Ponzi scheme. And your brother-in-law is broke. He drained every single penny from my parents' retirement funds 6 months ago to pay off angry investors who realized his tech startup was a shell company. That is a disgusting lie, Brenda shouted, the panic rising in her throat. You are just saying that because you hate him. Connor just bought your parents that new boat. Connor bought that boat using a high-interest title loan secretly secured against my parents' house, I replied, cutting through her denial like a scalpel. He forged my father's signature on the deed transfer. My parents are completely broke, Brenda. They have less than $200 in their checking account. They are just too blinded by the country club aesthetic to look at their own bank statements. They let a white con artist drain their life savings because he wore a nice suit and made them feel superior to everyone else. I could hear Brenda breathing heavily through the speakers. She was silent because deep down she knew I was right. She had always noticed the cracks in Connor's story, but like the rest of them, she chose the comfortable lie over the ugly truth. Listen to me carefully, Aunt Brenda, I said, steering my car into the fast lane. Tomorrow morning, the illusion is going to shatter. The people Connor owes money to are not the kind of people who send polite emails. They are the kind of people who seize assets. I am calling you right now to give you one piece of advice. When my mother calls you crying tomorrow asking for a loan, do not give her a single dime, because Connor will take that too. You are crazy, Brenda stammered, her voice shaking now. You are making this all up because you want to destroy this family. This family destroyed itself years ago, I said calmly. I just brought the shovel to bury it. I ended the call before she could respond. The silence in the car was beautiful. I watched the city lights approaching in the distance, reflecting off the sleek hood of my car. My parents had spent their entire lives treating me like an embarrassment, all while handing their financial security over to a smiling thief. They valued proximity to wealth over actual character. They wanted the white picket fence, the country club memberships, and the envy of their peers more than they wanted to protect their own daughter. and tomorrow they were going to wake up with nothing. I pressed down on the gas pedal. The engine hummed louder, carrying me away from the wreckage they were about to face. I had given them their chance. The gold box sitting on that mahogany table was a legal miracle that would have wiped Connor's underground debt clean. My private equity firm had spent the last 3 months aggressively acquiring the debt of Connor's creditors specifically to lay this trap. If they had just opened the box, they would have seen the settlement documents. If they had just treated me like a human being for 5 minutes, they would have kept their house. But they chose arrogance. They chose pride. And now the clock was ticking down to midnight. I pulled my car into the secure underground garage of my building. The security guard nodded respectfully as he opened the private elevator reserved for penthouse residents. My family thought I lived in a cramped studio apartment in a bad neighborhood, because that was the narrative that made them feel comfortable. The truth was, I lived in a $5 million penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The elevator doors opened directly into my foyer. The quiet luxury of my home was a stark contrast to the loud, desperate display of wealth I had just left behind at the country club. I walked across the imported hardwood floors, dropping my keys on the marble kitchen island. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the glittering city lights below. My phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a notification from Instagram. Monique had just gone live. I picked up the phone and tapped the screen, watching her face appear. She was sitting in the plush back seat of the leased Mercedes-Benz Connor drove. The interior lighting was perfectly adjusted to highlight the fake tears welling up in her eyes. She was holding the phone close to her face, using a subtle filter that made her look fragile and emotionally exhausted. "I cannot believe I even have to make this video," she began, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. Tonight was supposed to be a beautiful celebration for my parents' 40-year anniversary. We were at the Belmont Country Club, surrounded by our wonderful friends and our church family. But my older sister Valerie decided to show up uninvited and ruin everything. I took a slow sip of my water, watching the viewer count climb rapidly. Monique knew exactly how to play the victim. She was a master at manipulating the narrative to feed her own ego. "Valerie has always struggled," Monique continued, wiping a dry tear from her cheek. "She refuses to work hard, and she has always been incredibly jealous of my husband Connor and the life we have built. Tonight, she crashed the party looking completely disheveled just to beg my parents for money. Connor even offered her cash out of his own pocket to help her out, but she threw it in his face and caused a huge scene. It breaks my heart to see her so lost and bitter." I watched the comments start to flood in. Monique had deliberately tagged several elite members of our AM church, including Pastor Davis and Sister Jenkins, ensuring that the social damage would spread through our entire community. The church circle was the most important audience to my parents. It was where they derived all their social power and validation. The comments were exactly what you would expect from people who only knew the manufactured version of my family. Someone named Sister Roberts wrote, "Praying for your family. Monique, you and Connor have such gracious hearts." Another church member commented, "It is so sad when family members refuse to heal and try to tear down your blessings." Someone else added, "Connor is a saint for even trying to help her." I stood in my massive living room watching the digital lynch mob gather. A few years ago, this would have destroyed me. I would have frantically typed out paragraphs trying to defend myself. I would have posted screenshots of my bank accounts or tried to explain my side of the story. I would have let their lies dictate my emotional state. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical amusement. They were performing a play on a sinking ship. Monique kept talking, staring mournfully into the camera. "We are just going to focus on love tonight," she said bravely. "We are going to pray for Valerie and hope she finds peace. We are not going to let her toxic energy ruin our family legacy." She paused, waiting for more sympathetic comments to roll in. The viewer count was over 300 now. The elite circles of our community were eating out of her hand. I set my water glass down on the counter. I opened the keyboard on my phone. I did not need to defend myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I only needed to send a message to the two people who actually knew they were living a lie. I typed out one single comment. Enjoy the rest of the night, Monique. I hope Connor wiped his hard drives. I hit send. I watched my comment appear at the very bottom of the scrolling chat. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Monique was still talking about forgiveness and grace. Then her eyes darted down to read the new comment. The change in her demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying to watch. The fake, vulnerable smile completely vanished. Her face drained of color. The phone in her hand physically shook. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open slightly as she stared at the words on the screen. "Babe, what is it?" Connor asked from the front seat of the car. He sounded annoyed. "Are you still on that stupid live stream?" Monique did not answer him. She just kept staring at my comment, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine panic. The viewers in the chat started asking questions. They noticed the shift. They started asking what the comment meant and who Valerie was talking about. Suddenly, the screen went entirely black. The live stream ended abruptly. Monique had panicked and shut down the entire broadcast. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the soft cushions of my expensive sofa. I let out a long, slow exhale. The silence of my penthouse wrapped around me like a protective blanket. Down in the streets below, people were going about their lives completely unaware of the financial earthquake that was about to strike my family. Monique and Connor were probably sitting in that parked luxury car right now screaming at each other. Connor was probably realizing that his carefully constructed house of cards was finally collapsing. He had spent the last 6 months defrauding investors, stealing the retirement money of my parents, and forging property deeds, all while playing the arrogant hero. And now he knew that I knew. I walked over to the smart panel on my wall and dimmed the lights in the living room. The digital clock on the stove glowed softly in the dark kitchen. It was 10:30 at night. In exactly 90 minutes, the gold box I left on the mahogany table at the country club would officially expire. The $1.2 million debt that my private equity firm had quietly purchased from the dangerous creditors Connor had would default. And when it defaulted, the legal mechanisms would trigger automatically. I did not feel guilty. My parents chose their aesthetic over their daughter. They chose a white con artist over their own flesh and blood. They wanted a legacy built on lies, and tomorrow they were going to get exactly what they paid for. I turned away from the window and headed toward my bedroom to get a good night's sleep. The morning was going to be very busy. I walked into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. My laptop was open on the nightstand, glowing softly in the dark. On the screen was a live digital clock counting down the final minutes to midnight. I stared at the numbers, feeling a profound sense of closure. 10 miles away, the gold-wrapped box was probably sitting exactly where I left it on the mahogany table in the country club lobby. Or maybe a janitor had already swept it into a trash bin. My parents had treated it like garbage, but they had no idea they had literally thrown away their only chance at survival. Inside that crushed gold paper was not a cheap candle or a discount store picture frame. It was a thick stack of legally binding settlement documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. 6 months ago, Connor had gotten desperate. His fake Wall Street persona was crumbling. He had borrowed heavily from a syndicate of shadow lenders to keep up the appearance of wealth for Monique and my parents. When those dangerous lenders came to collect, Connor panicked. He did the unthinkable. He stole the original deed to my parents' sprawling colonial estate. He forged my father's signature and used the family home as collateral for a $1.2 million underground loan. My parents were completely oblivious. They were too busy bragging about Connor's imaginary promotions at church to notice their entire legacy was signed away to criminals. But those criminals made a mistake. They packaged Connor's debt along with several other toxic assets and sold it to a larger financial institution. 2 weeks ago, my private equity firm, V Apex Holdings, quietly acquired that exact portfolio. The moment my compliance team flagged Connor's name and the forged deed, I knew the universe had handed me the ultimate weapon. I owned Connor's debt. I owned my parents' house. The documents inside that gold box were a complete and total amnesty agreement. I had drafted them myself with my lead attorney. If my parents had simply opened the box, they would have found a contract fully releasing the lien on their house and wiping Connor's debt to zero. All they had to do was sign on the dotted line. It was a golden ticket, a miracle wrapped in gold paper. I had offered them salvation on a silver platter just to see if they could muster a single ounce of human decency toward me. They could not. They chose to humiliate me instead. While the clock ticked down, my parents were probably back at their sprawling estate, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to give way. I imagined Yolanda unzipping her sequined gown and pouring another glass of expensive champagne, laughing with Richard about how they had successfully driven me away from their perfect anniversary party. They probably felt so powerful, so elite. They had no idea that they did not even own the roof over their heads anymore. Meanwhile, Connor was likely pacing the floor of his leased mansion, hyperventilating. He knew the deadline for his loan was tonight. He knew the lenders he originally borrowed from did not send polite collection letters. He probably thought violent men were coming for him. He had no idea his debt had been legally purchased by the sister-in-law he had just thrown $100 bill at. He had no idea I was the one holding the leash. The digital clock on my laptop flipped to 11:58. 2 minutes left. My phone lay completely silent beside it. There were no frantic calls apologizing for their behavior at the country club. There were no text messages asking me to come back and join the family. They had made their choice. They had doubled down on their arrogance and their toxic pride. The glowing numbers shifted to 11:59. I reached out and rested my hand on the laptop keyboard. The settlement documents in the gold box had a very specific clause written into the fine print. The amnesty offer was valid only until midnight on the date of their anniversary. The moment the clock struck 12, the offer would be permanently revoked. The debt would default immediately. And my legal team had already pre-filed the paperwork to execute a hostile foreclosure and alert federal authorities to Connor's massive financial fraud the exact second the default occurred. I watched the seconds tick down on the screen. 10:98. I thought about the heavy garbage bag my mother had thrown at my feet when I was 18 years old. 7:65. I thought about the cold marble floor of the country club and my father swatting the gift out of my hands with pure disgust. 4:32. I thought about Monique crying fake tears on the internet to destroy my reputation within our community. 1. The clock struck 12:00. Midnight. I let out a slow, steady breath. The trap snapped shut. Instantly, a green checkmark appeared on my laptop screen. My firm's automated legal software recognized the expired deadline. A flurry of encrypted emails were automatically dispatched. Warrants were electronically triggered. Foreclosure notices were officially logged into the county database. The local sheriff's department received a priority fraud alert with undeniable documentary evidence attached, showing exactly how Connor had forged the real estate documents. It was all in motion now, and no amount of crying or praying or name-dropping could stop it. The system was ruthless, and it did not care about their country club memberships. I closed the laptop screen, plunging the bedroom into complete darkness. The aesthetic they had worshipped for decades was officially dead. The fake legacy they cared so much about was completely erased. I pulled the heavy down comforter over my shoulders and closed my eyes. For the first time in my entire life, I slept perfectly through the night, knowing that tomorrow morning the universe was finally going to hand them the exact bill they had been running from for years. I woke up the next morning right at 8 o'clock. Sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I stretched my arms, feeling completely rested and utterly at peace. The air in my penthouse was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding across town. I rolled over on the silk sheets and reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up instantly. The numbers stared back at me in bright white font. 114 missed calls. There were also 72 unread text messages. Most of the missed calls were from my mother Yolanda, but there were quite a few from my father Richard and even a handful from Monique. I did not feel any rush to call them back. I swung my legs out of bed and walked barefoot across the smooth hardwood floor into my kitchen. I walked over to the marble counter and started my morning routine. I opened a fresh bag of expensive coffee beans and inhaled the deep, earthy scent. I measured the beans carefully and poured them into the burr grinder. The loud grinding noise filled the quiet room for a few seconds, drowning out the silence. I set the paper filter into the glass, pour-over mechanism, and waited for the electric kettle to bring the water to the perfect temperature. The process of making pour-over coffee requires patience and precision. You cannot rush it. I poured a small amount of hot water over the grounds, letting them bloom. The rich aroma filled the air, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. While the water slowly dripped through the filter, I picked up my phone and tapped the voicemail icon. I set the phone down on the counter and turned on the speaker. I wanted the room to hear it. The audio progression of those messages was a masterclass in the complete collapse of human arrogance. The first message was recorded at 6:12 in the morning. It was Yolanda. Her voice was sharp and filled with that familiar entitled anger that she had wielded like a weapon my entire life. "Valerie, wake up and call me back right this instant," she demanded. "Some absolute idiots from the bank are banging on our front door, making a massive scene. They are claiming there is an issue with the deed to the house. This is completely unacceptable and embarrassing. I need you to wire us $50,000 right now to clear up whatever clerical error this is before the neighbors wake up and see these people on our lawn. Call me the second you hear this. You owe us that much after the stunt you pulled last night." The message ended with an angry click. I took another slow, circular pour of hot water over the coffee grounds, watching the dark liquid drip steadily into the glass carafe below. They still thought money was a magic wand that could wave away their problems. They still thought I owed them my compliance. The next relevant voicemail came in at 6:45. This time it was my father, Richard. His voice was lower, tense, and vibrating with poorly concealed panic. "Valerie, answer your phone," he barked. "This is not a joke. These men are holding a foreclosure notice with my signature on it, but I never signed anything. They are saying Connor used the house as collateral for $1 million loan. That is impossible. Connor is a Wall Street expert. I have been trying to call Connor for the last half hour and his phone is going straight to voicemail. I need you to use your connections at the bank to stop this right now. Do not ignore me, Valerie. I am your father and I am telling you to fix this." I poured the finished coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. I wrapped both hands around the warm clay and took a slow sip. The flavor was deep and complex, much like the situation playing out 10 miles away. Richard was finally realizing that the golden boy he worshipped had sold him out to save his own skin. The third voicemail played. It was time-stamped at 7:20. Yolanda's voice had changed completely. The commanding tone was entirely gone. In its place was the shrill, shaky sound of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Valerie, please." She practically begged, her breath catching in her throat. "Please pick up the phone. The police are here. There are 2 cruisers parked in our driveway. They are telling us we have to pack a single bag and vacate the premises immediately. They said the house belongs to a company called V Apex Holdings. They are talking about fraud, Valerie. They are saying Connor committed federal fraud. Monique is screaming in the driveway and Connor is nowhere to be found. Please, Valerie, you work in finance. You have to know how to stop this. They are treating us like common criminals." I walked over to the living room window and looked out over the city. The sun was fully up now, painting the skyscrapers in brilliant shades of gold and silver. Yolanda's tears meant nothing to me. She was not crying because she felt remorse for how she had treated me. She was crying because the elite church friends she cared so much about were probably peering out of their windows watching her get evicted. She was grieving her social status, not her family. The final voicemail I listened to was from just a few minutes before 8 o'clock. Yolanda was sobbing hysterically. The background noise was chaotic. I could hear men shouting instructions and the sound of heavy wooden doors being slammed shut. "Valerie, please," she wailed. "They are changing the locks on the front door. We are standing on the sidewalk in our pajamas." Richard is holding his chest. He is having a panic attack. We have nowhere to go. Please, sweetie, I know we said some harsh things last night, but we are your family. You have to help us. Please call me back. I am begging you. The message beeped and the phone went silent. I took another sip of my coffee. Sweetie. That was a new word. She had not called me sweetie since I was a child. It is amazing how quickly toxic people discover their affection for you when they need something from you. They had spent my entire life pushing me down the stairs of their expectations, and now they were surprised that I was not standing at the bottom waiting to catch them. I set my empty coffee mug down on the smooth marble counter. The morning sun was fully illuminating my penthouse, but my attention was completely focused on the digital world. I walked over to my home office and picked up my silver iPad from the sleek wooden desk. I swiped the screen to unlock it and tapped on a small blue icon in the corner of the display. It was a security camera application. 5 years ago, there had been a sudden string of burglaries in my parents' affluent neighborhood. People were losing expensive jewelry and high-end electronics. Trying to be a good daughter, I had purchased and personally installed a top-of-the-line security camera system for their sprawling colonial estate. I spent an entire weekend running wires and setting up the sensors. Instead of thanking me, my father Richard had mocked the equipment, calling it cheap paranoid garbage. My mother Yolanda had complained endlessly that the sleek black cameras ruined the historical aesthetic of her pristine front porch. They hated the system because it came from me, but they were too lazy to ever take it down or hire someone to replace it. They also never bothered to change the master passwords. I still had full administrative access to every single camera on the property. The application loaded, and the high-definition live feeds populated my screen. I split the display into 4 distinct camera angles: the front porch, the wide driveway, the main foyer, and the backyard patio. I sat down in my plush office chair and watched the chaos unfold like it was a high-budget cinema production. On the front porch feed, the situation was escalating rapidly. The grand mahogany doors of my parents' estate were securely locked, but the people standing outside were not going to wait much longer. There were 4 heavily armed police officers wearing dark tactical vests. Their faces were stern and completely devoid of sympathy. Standing right behind them were 3 intimidating men in sharp gray suits. These were the asset recovery agents, the repo men sent by my private equity firm to execute the hostile foreclosure. One of the agents was holding a thick metal clipboard, tapping a pen against it with rhythmic impatience. I watched as the largest police officer raised his heavy fist and pounded violently on the mahogany door. The deep thudding sound picked up by the camera microphone was incredibly loud, making my iPad speakers vibrate. "Open the door, Richard," the officer shouted, his voice echoing across the pristine, manicured lawn. "We have a federal warrant and a court-ordered eviction notice. If you do not open this door in the next 60 seconds, we are legally authorized to breach the entrance." I switched my attention to the camera feed showing the wide driveway. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were reflecting off the pristine white columns of the house. But what really caught my eye was the activity on the street behind the cruisers. The elite neighborhood was waking up. These were the people Yolanda spent her entire life trying to impress. The wealthy doctors, the corporate lawyers, the church elders. I could see Mrs. Carmichael from the country club walking her purebred poodle. She had stopped completely frozen on the sidewalk, staring open-mouthed at the spectacle. Mr. Henderson, the bank executive next door, was standing on his porch wearing a silk robe, holding a newspaper, and pointing at my parents' house. The social ruin was absolute. The carefully crafted illusion of generational wealth was burning to the ground in broad daylight, and everyone in their prestigious circle had a front row seat. I dragged my finger across the iPad screen to enlarge the camera feed from the inside main foyer. The contrast between the confident, heavily armed men outside and the pathetic scene inside was striking. My mother Yolanda was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. She was wearing her lavish silk pajamas, but her hair was a messy, tangled bird nest. She kept grabbing her own face and pulling at her hair, a stark departure from the poised, arrogant woman who had swatted my gift away the night before. Richard was standing near the sweeping staircase, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He was clutching his chest with one hand and holding his cell phone with the other. He was screaming into the phone, but I could tell he was only getting voicemail. He was desperately trying to call Connor, the golden boy, the Wall Street genius, who had secretly used this very house as collateral for an underground loan. Richard looked small and terrified. The imposing patriarch who loved to use his height to intimidate me was suddenly reduced to a weak, panicking old man. I turned the volume up on the iPad. I wanted to hear every single word. "This cannot be happening," Yolanda wailed, her voice echoing in the grand foyer. "Richard, you have to call the mayor, call Judge Patterson, tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. We are respectable people. They cannot treat us like criminals." "Judge Patterson is not picking up his phone," Richard yelled back, a heavy note of despair cracking his voice. "Nobody is picking up their phones, Yolanda. Connor has vanished. His phone is completely disconnected. I do not understand what is happening." Boom, boom, boom. The police officer slammed his fist against the mahogany door again. The sound made both of my parents jump out of their skin. Yolanda let out a shrill scream and backed away from the entrance, stumbling over an expensive antique vase. "We are breaching the door in 10 seconds, the officer warned from outside. "Stand back." I watched with cold clinical satisfaction as Richard finally realized he had no other options left. His wealth was fake. His connections were useless against a federal fraud warrant. His favorite son-in-law was a criminal who had stolen everything from them. He slowly walked toward the front door, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out to unlock the deadbolt. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my legs. The trap I had set was flawless. They had spent decades building a fortress of lies and entitlement. They had rejected my help because it did not come wrapped in the aesthetic they demanded. And now they were opening the door to their own destruction. The live feed was the best television I had watched in years. As Richard turned the heavy brass lock, I toggled my screen to show all 4 camera feeds at once. The heavy mahogany door swung inward, revealing my broken father to the stern police officers and the ruthless asset recovery agents. Yolanda fell to her knees in the background, weeping loudly. The officers immediately stepped into the foyer, taking total control of the property. My childhood home, the fortress of expectations I could never meet, was no longer theirs. I watched the agents hand Richard the foreclosure documents pointing directly to the forged signatures. It was a beautiful masterclass in consequences. I took a deep breath of the quiet air in my penthouse, perfectly ready for the next act of the morning drama to unfold. My attention shifted back to the split screen on my iPad, specifically the camera angle covering the wide driveway and the side garden gate. While Richard and Yolanda were being handed their financial death sentence inside the foyer, the real architect of their misery was desperately trying to save himself outside. The heavy wooden gate on the side of the house creaked open. A figure slipped through the gap, moving with panicked, jerky motions. It was Connor. The Wall Street genius. The golden boy. The man who had arrogantly tossed a $100 bill at my feet just 12 hours ago was currently wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. He was clutching a stuffed leather duffel bag tightly against his chest. He was not running toward the front door to help his wife or his in-laws. He was sneaking through the bushes, trying to use the tall manicured hedges as cover to reach his leased white Mercedes parked at the far edge of the driveway. He had a one-way ticket to Switzerland waiting for him at the airport, and he was fully prepared to leave Monique and her parents to take the fall for his $1 million fraud. I leaned closer to the screen, watching his pathetic attempt at stealth. He looked nothing like the smug elite financial expert my family worshipped. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate common criminal fleeing the scene of his crime. Connor made it to the edge of the hedges and paused. The police cruisers were flashing their bright red and blue lights across the lawn. The asset recovery agents were standing near the front porch. Connor thought he had a clear path to his car door. He broke into a full sprint across the wet morning grass. But he underestimated the officer's perimeter. A young police officer standing near the back of the second cruiser spotted the sudden movement. "Hey, stop right there!" the officer yelled, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air. "Drop the bag and put your hands where I can see them." Connor did not stop. The panic completely took over his brain. He fumbled with his keys, wildly pressing the unlock button on his key fob. The Mercedes chirped in response. He reached for the door handle, but his expensive leather shoes slipped on the damp grass. He never even got the door open. The young officer closed the distance in seconds, lowering his shoulder and tackling Connor directly into the side of the luxury vehicle. The impact was heavy and loud. Connor let out a sharp cry as the breath was knocked out of his lungs. The heavy leather duffel bag flew out of his hands, hitting the concrete driveway and bursting open. Stacks of rubber-banded cash, several fake passports, and a handful of expensive watches spilled out onto the ground for everyone to see. This was the emergency fund he had secretly drained from my parents' retirement accounts. He had literally packed their entire future into a bag to fund his solo escape. Two more officers rushed over, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. "Stop resisting! Put your hands behind your back," they ordered, pressing Connor's face aggressively into the wet grass. The golden boy was writhing in the dirt, his designer hoodie stained with mud, his pristine image permanently destroyed. Just as the cold metal handcuffs clicked around Connor's wrists, the front door of the house burst open. Monique stumbled out onto the porch. She had thrown on a silk robe over her pajamas, and her face was stained with the remnants of yesterday's expensive makeup. She froze at the top of the brick steps, her eyes locked onto the scene unfolding on the driveway. She saw her husband pinned to the ground by 3 armed officers. She saw the scattered cash and the fake passports. She saw the leased Mercedes that he had tried to escape in without her. The realization hit her instantly. He was leaving. The man she had mocked me for, the husband she had weaponized against our entire family, was abandoning her to face the federal authorities completely alone. Connor Monique screamed a raw, guttural sound that tore through the quiet neighborhood. "What are you doing? Let him go. He did not do anything wrong." She tried to run down the steps toward him, but an officer stepped in her path, holding up a stern hand to keep her back. "Mom, stay exactly where you are," the officer commanded. "Your husband is being placed under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud and forging real estate documents." Monique collapsed onto the brick walkway, sobbing hysterically. She kept screaming his name, but Connor did not even look at her as the officers hauled him to his feet. His face was smeared with mud, and his expression was completely blank. He knew it was over. The illusion had evaporated. The real tragedy for my family was not just the arrest, it was the audience. The camera feed showed the crowd of elite neighbors that had gathered on the sidewalks. These were the same people Monique had tagged in her fake crying video last night. These were the church elders and the country club members whose approval dictated every single decision my parents ever made. Mrs. Carmichael was standing perfectly still, holding her poodle's leash tightly, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. She was whispering to another neighbor, pointing directly at the scattered cash on the driveway. Mr. Henderson, the bank executive, was shaking his head in disgust, clearly recognizing the signs of a massive financial collapse. He had always suspected Connor was a lightweight, and now his suspicions were brutally confirmed on the front lawn. Pastor Davis from the AIM Church had just pulled up in his sedan and was staring at Connor in handcuffs with a look of profound disappointment. My parents had sacrificed their relationship with their eldest daughter to buy a ticket into this exact social circle. They had traded their dignity for the envy of these neighbors. And now those same neighbors were watching them get publicly humiliated, stripped of their fake wealth, and exposed as complete frauds. The officers shoved Connor into the back of the police cruiser, pushing his head down to clear the doorframe. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, sealing his fate. Monique was still wailing on the ground, beating her fists against the bricks, while my mother Yolanda stood frozen in the doorway, too paralyzed by the social embarrassment to even go comfort her favorite child. I watched the entire sequence from the quiet safety of my penthouse. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. They had worshipped a false idol because he was white and wore an expensive suit, completely ignoring his terrible character. They had eagerly participated in my destruction to protect his fragile ego. The universe was just finally forcing them to read the price tag on the lifestyle they had chosen. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitter, rich flavor wash over my tongue, perfectly satisfied with the morning entertainment. Back inside the sprawling colonial estate, the situation had reached its breaking point. The heavily armed officers were systematically moving through the first floor, clearing the rooms to ensure the property was secure. Richard and Yolanda were being corralled toward the front door like unwanted trespassers in their own home. They had not been given time to pack a single bag or even change out of their expensive sleepwear. Richard was wearing a set of deep burgundy silk pajamas that he had custom ordered from a high-end boutique downtown. Yolanda was shivering slightly in her sheer matching robe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The grand crystal chandelier above them cast a harsh, unforgiving light on their panicked faces. The asset recovery agent in the gray suit was standing near the sweeping staircase, aggressively tapping his pen against his metal clipboard. "This is an absolute outrage," Richard bellowed, planting his feet on the expensive Persian rug and refusing to move any further toward the exit. "I demand to speak to your superior officer immediately. You have no right to march into my home and order me out like a common criminal. I am personal friends with Mayor Johnson. I golf with Judge Patterson every single weekend at the Belmont Country Club. One phone call and every single one of you will be looking for a new job by tomorrow morning." The largest police officer, the one who had pounded on the door just minutes earlier, let out a tired, heavy sigh. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my father. He did not look intimidated by the name-dropping. He looked completely exhausted by it. "Mr. Brooks." The officer said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "You can call the mayor. You can call the governor. You can call the President of the United States. For all I care. But right now, you are standing on private property that you no longer legally own. If you do not step outside onto that sidewalk in the next 30 seconds, I am going to have to physically remove you and add trespassing to your list of problems this morning." Richard puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his deep voice to assert dominance, just like he used to do to me when I was a teenager. "I own this house," he roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "My name is on the deed. My family built this legacy." The asset recovery agent stepped forward, holding out his metal clipboard. He flipped to the second page of a thick legal document and pointed a manicured finger at the bottom line. "Not anymore. Mr. Brooks," the agent said, his voice smooth and completely devoid of emotion. "This property was officially foreclosed upon at exactly 12:00 a.m. this morning, due to a default on a $1.2 million high-interest title loan. The debt was purchased and executed by V Apex Holdings." "That is a lie," Richard screamed, stepping closer to the agent. "I never took out $1 million loan against this house. I have never even heard of V Apex Holdings in my entire life." The agent did not flinch. He simply unclipped a piece of paper from the stack and handed it directly to Richard. It was a high-resolution copy of the original loan agreement. "Take a close look at the signature line on page 4, Mr. Brooks," the agent said coldly. The paperwork was notarized and submitted to the county clerk's office 6 months ago by a Mr. Connor Hayes. The funds were wired directly to multiple offshore accounts connected to his name. Richard snatched the paper from the agent's hand. His eyes scanned the document rapidly, reading over the dense legal jargon until he reached the bottom of the page. There, glaring back at him in black ink, was his own signature. But it was not his handwriting. It was a perfect forgery, an exact replica of the way he signed his name on country club checks and church donation envelopes. The kind of signature only someone who lived in his house and managed his finances would know how to fake so perfectly. The color completely drained from Richard's face. His hands began to shake violently, crumpling the edges of the legal document. "Connor," he whispered, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. He forged my name. He stole the house. Yolanda let out a sharp, terrified gasp. What are you talking about, Richard? She cried, grabbing his arm frantically. What does that paper say? What did Connor do? Richard did not answer her. He just stood there, staring at the forged signature, his entire reality collapsing around him in real time. The golden boy, the Wall Street genius they had chosen over their own flesh and blood, had systematically stripped them of everything they owned. The irony was absolutely suffocating. They had kicked me out of this very house at 18 years old because I refused to give Monique my meager paychecks to buy a luxury car. And now Monique's husband had taken the entire house from them to fund his own escape. All right, folks, time is up, the police officer said, stepping behind Richard and placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Let us go. Outside now. Yolanda started to cry hysterically, pleading with the officers as they physically guided her toward the open doorway. Please, she sobbed, tears ruining her expensive face cream. All my jewelry is upstairs. My grandmother's pearls are in the safe. You cannot just throw us out into the street with nothing. Let me go upstairs and get my things. Please, I am begging you. The asset recovery agent shook his head slowly. The contents of this property are currently frozen, pending a full federal investigation into the fraud committed by your son-in-law, he explained mechanically. Any attempt to remove assets from the premises will be considered a federal crime. You need to exit the building immediately. The officers pushed Richard and Yolanda out onto the front porch. The cool morning air hit them instantly, making them shiver in their thin silk pajamas. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind them with a loud, decisive thud. The sound echoed across the perfectly manicured lawn, signaling the absolute end of their reign. Richard stood on the brick steps staring blankly at the police cruisers and the elite neighbors watching from the sidewalks. The man who had arrogantly swatted my gift away 12 hours ago was now completely homeless and penniless, standing in front of the community he had sacrificed his own daughter to impress. Yolanda collapsed onto the top step, burying her face in her hands and weeping loudly, the picture of total defeat. I watched the entire scene play out on my iPad screen, feeling nothing but cold, calculated justice. The house was finally clean. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the neighborhood. Richard, Yolanda, and Monique stood shivering on the concrete sidewalk outside the wrought iron gates of the estate they used to own. Monique was still weeping softly, hugging her silk robe tightly against the chill. Her husband was in the back of a police cruiser speeding toward a federal holding cell, but Yolanda and Richard were entirely focused on their own survival. The neighborhood spectacle was becoming unbearable. Mrs. Carmichael was still standing down the block, pretending to adjust her poodle's collar while actively staring. Mr. Henderson had actually pulled out his phone and was quietly recording the scene from his porch. The social humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on my parents' shoulders. Every second they stood on that sidewalk was a dagger to their fragile egos. They had spent 20 years convincing these neighbors they were untouchable, and now they were public entertainment. Richard pulled his cell phone from the pocket of his burgundy silk pajamas. His hands were still shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. He was desperate to find someone, anyone who could fix this massive inconvenience. He called his personal banker first. The call went straight to voicemail. He called Judge Patterson again. No answer. He called his golf partner, a prominent real estate attorney in the city. The phone rang 5 times before the attorney finally picked up. Richard started talking immediately, his voice frantic and loud. Charles, you have to help me. Some asset recovery agents just locked me out of my own house. They are claiming Connor forged my signature for $1 million loan. This has to be a mistake, Charles. You need to get down here and sort this mess out before my wife has a nervous breakdown right on the street. I listened to the entire conversation through the hidden microphone I had installed near the front gate months ago. The audio feed on my iPad was perfectly clear. Charles let out a heavy, uncomfortable sigh through the phone. Richard, I saw the filings this morning. The whole firm saw them. The police report is already circulating through the country club group chat. Connor took out a massive title loan from a shadow syndicate and he defaulted. The deed is gone, Richard. There is absolutely nothing I can do for you. Richard paced back and forth on the sidewalk, his silk pajamas flapping in the morning breeze. What do you mean there is nothing you can do? He demanded, his face turning red again. I am the victim here. Charles, you know the judge, you know the mayor. We can file an injunction. We can freeze the asset transfer. You are the best lawyer in the state, so act like it. The attorney spoke slowly, as if he were explaining a complex concept to a small child. Richard, you do not understand who you are dealing with. The original Shadow Syndicate sold the debt 2 weeks ago. It was purchased by a firm called VE Apex Holdings. They are a private equity firm that specializes in aggressive corporate takeovers and hostile asset liquidations. They are absolutely ruthless. They do not negotiate, and they do not care about your country club memberships. The moment the clock struck midnight last night, the foreclosure was executed flawlessly by their automated legal department. Legally speaking, they own the property now. You need to find a hotel, Richard. I have to go. The call disconnected. Richard slowly lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen. He looked completely hollowed out. The realization that his powerful friends were abandoning him hit harder than the eviction itself. He turned to Yolanda and Monique, who were waiting desperately for good news. He told them everything. He told them about the default, the Shadow Syndicate, and the terrifying reputation of V Apex Holdings. Monique let out another loud wail, burying her face in her hands. Yolanda, however, reacted differently. The initial shock and panic were wearing off, replaced by her default state of delusional entitlement. She refused to accept that her status meant nothing. Her mind simply could not process a reality where she was not the most important person in the room. V Apex Holdings. Yolanda repeated the name, tasting the syllables with pure disgust. Who do these people think they are? They cannot just swoop in and steal our family legacy because of a clerical error made by a stupid boy. We are the Brooks family. We are pillars of this community. We donate heavily to the church, and we host the charity gala every single spring. She marched over to Richard and grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop. Richard, we are not going to stand out here on the sidewalk like a bunch of homeless beggars for the neighbors to laugh at. Call a car service right now. We are going downtown. We are going directly to the headquarters of this V Apex Holdings. Richard looked at her like she had lost her mind. Yolanda? We are in our pajamas. My cars are locked inside the garage and the police will not let us back in to get the keys. We have no money. We cannot just show up at a corporate office looking like this. They will call security and have us thrown out into the street. We absolutely can and we will. Yolanda snapped, her eyes flashing with a terrifying mix of desperation and pride. I do not care if we are in our sleepwear. We have social standing. When the chief executive officer of this firm sees who we are and realizes the terrible mistake his rogue agents have made, he will apologize and give us our keys back. These corporate types always bow down to old money. We just have to go down there and demand the respect we deserve. They probably just do not know who we are yet. It was a masterclass in delusion. My mother honestly believed that her arrogant attitude could override federal law and millions of dollars in defaulted debt. She genuinely thought her imaginary social status was an impenetrable shield against the consequences of her own ignorance. She believed the rules simply did not apply to her. Richard was too broken and exhausted to argue with her. He opened the ride-sharing application on his phone. His primary premium credit card had already been declined because it was linked to the accounts Connor had completely drained, but he managed to book a basic car using an old backup card he kept hidden in his phone case. 15 minutes later, a small dented economy car pulled up to the curb. It was a far cry from the tinted luxury vehicles my family was used to riding in. The driver, a young college student wearing a faded sweatshirt, looked absolutely baffled as 3 wealthy people wearing silk pajamas and robes climbed into the cramped back seat of his vehicle. Monique was still sobbing softly, clutching her phone and shivering. Richard stared blankly out the window, watching his beautiful house recede into the distance. Yolanda sat rigidly in the middle, holding her chin high, refusing to let the humiliating circumstances break her completely fabricated sense of dignity. I sat in my penthouse watching the small car pull away from the curb and disappear down the street through the security camera feed. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. The final act of this tragedy was moving exactly according to my script. They were heading straight into the belly of the beast, completely unaware that the ruthless corporate entity they were planning to intimidate was entirely controlled by the daughter they had thrown away. I closed the iPad application and stood up from my desk. It was time for me to get dressed and head to the office. I had some very important guests arriving soon. I changed into a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that projected absolute authority. My personal driver was already waiting downstairs in the secure garage. The ride to the financial district was quick and smooth. V Apex Holdings occupied the top 10 floors of a towering glass and steel skyscraper right in the heart of the city. The building was a fortress of modern corporate power. The lobby was a vast expanse of white marble and brushed steel intentionally designed to make visitors feel incredibly small and intimidated. I took my private executive elevator up to the penthouse office suite and settled into the plush leather chair behind my massive mahogany desk. I tapped my keyboard, pulling up the ground floor security camera feeds on my large monitor, and waited for the show to begin. It did not take long. Roughly 20 minutes later, the dented economy car pulled up to the pristine glass doors of the main entrance. Richard, Yolanda, and Monique spilled out onto the busy downtown sidewalk looking entirely out of place. The morning rush of wealthy corporate executives and high-powered investment bankers parted around them. People in custom-tailored suits stopped holding their expensive briefcases, staring in blatant confusion at the three people wearing silk pajamas and wrinkled robes. Yolanda led the charge. She marched through the heavy revolving doors with her chin held high, clinging desperately to her shattered pride. She honestly believed her invisible social status would protect her from looking completely ridiculous. Richard followed closely behind, looking nervously at the towering security guards stationed near the elevator banks. His bare feet were stuffed into leather loafers without socks, and his burgundy pajamas were severely wrinkled. Monique trailed in the back, wiping her eyes and shivering violently in the fiercely air-conditioned lobby. Yolanda walked directly up to the main reception desk. The receptionist was a highly trained professional named Sarah, who dealt with aggressive, arrogant men in $1,000 suits every single day. Sarah looked up and blinked in mild surprise at the sheer robe Yolanda was wearing, but maintained her perfectly polite corporate smile. Yolanda slammed her hand flat against the sleek marble counter. "I demand to speak to the Chief Executive Officer of V Apex Holdings." Immediately, Yolanda announced, her voice echoing loudly across the quiet, cavernous lobby. Sarah did not flinch. She politely asked if they had an appointment on the schedule today. Yolanda scoffed loudly, leaning her body over the counter as if proximity would make her more intimidating. "We do not need an appointment." She snapped, her tone dripping with venom. "We are the Brooks family. Your rogue agents just illegally locked us out of our estate this morning due to a ridiculous clerical error. I am here to have the person in charge rectify this situation right now and hand us back our keys." Sarah calmly typed something into her computer and explained that nobody could go upstairs to the executive levels without a scheduled meeting and proper security clearance. She suggested they contact the legal department via email. This calm answer completely set Yolanda off. Her delusion took over completely. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" She screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing off the marble walls. Several executives in the lobby stopped to watch the spectacle. "We are personal friends with Mayor Johnson. We golf with federal judges. You are going to pick up that phone and tell your boss that Richard and Yolanda Brooks are waiting down here, or I will personally see to it that you are fired and blacklisted from working in this city ever again." Richard stepped forward, trying to add his deep voice to the threat, but he just sounded tired and pathetic. "Listen to my wife," he ordered weakly. "We are very important people, and we expect to be treated with basic respect." The disruption was too loud. Three large security guards wearing sharp black suits began walking purposefully toward the reception desk. They moved with military precision, completely unfazed by the name-dropping. "Sir Mom, it is time for you to leave the building." One of the guards said, his voice low and dangerous. He reached out to grab Richard's arm. "You are causing a disturbance, and you are trespassing on corporate property. Walk out those doors right now, or we will physically throw you onto the sidewalk and call the local precinct." Yolanda started to panic, backing away from the massive guard. "You cannot touch us!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the security team. "We are the Brooks family." Up in my office, I smiled. The timing was absolutely perfect. They had reached the peak of their humiliation and desperation. I reached across my desk and pressed the intercom button on my phone. Sarah picked up instantly, her voice calm despite the chaos happening 2 feet away from her. "Yes, boss," she said. "Send them up," I commanded softly. Down in the lobby, Sarah held up a hand signaling the 3 security guards to stop. The guards immediately stepped back, folding their arms, but keeping a close eye on Richard. Sarah looked at my parents, her expression shifting from polite corporate annoyance to genuine bewilderment. "The chief executive officer will see you now," Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly in the tense silence of the lobby. Yolanda let out a heavy breath, smoothing her sheer robe and smiling triumphantly. She turned to look at Richard with a smug, arrogant expression. "I told you, Richard," she sneered loudly enough for the whole lobby to hear. "They know exactly who we are." "Old money talks." Richard let out a sigh of relief, running a hand over his tired face. "Who did you say we are meeting with?" "Exactly?" Richard asked the receptionist, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah looked down at her computer screen, verifying the information, and then looked directly into Richard's eyes. "You are meeting with CEO Valerie Brooks," she replied smoothly. "The security guards will escort you to her private elevator." The triumphant smile on Yolanda's face instantly melted away. The sheer magnitude of the name struck her like a physical blow. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and sick. Richard staggered backward a few steps, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Monique stopped crying, completely frozen in place, staring at the receptionist as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. Valerie Yolanda whispered the name, choking in her throat. "That is impossible. She works at a bank." The security guards did not give them time to process the reality shifting around them. "Right this way," the lead guard ordered, gesturing toward a set of heavy steel elevator doors hidden behind a glass partition. My parents and my sister walked toward the private elevator, moving like mindless zombies. Their arrogant entitlement had evaporated, leaving nothing but cold, suffocating dread. They stepped into the steel box, their reflection staring back at them in their wrinkled pajamas. The heavy doors slid shut, sealing them inside. They were slowly ascending to the penthouse, entirely at the mercy of the daughter they had thrown away, like garbage. The soft chime of the private elevator echoed through the expansive penthouse boardroom. The heavy steel doors slid silently open, revealing my family huddled together in the sleek modern foyer. The boardroom was designed to intimidate. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city. In the center of the room sat a massive custom glass conference table surrounded by black leather ergonomic chairs. I sat at the very head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the cool glass. My assistant stood quietly in the corner, holding a digital tablet. My parents and sister stepped out of the elevator. The bright natural sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted every single wrinkle in their silk pajamas and every smudge of ruined makeup on their faces. They looked incredibly small. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. They just stared at me. They took in the expensive charcoal gray suit I was wearing, the sleek corporate environment, and the undeniable reality that the daughter they had always called a failure was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. I watched the psychological gears turning in my mother's head. A normal person would have felt shame. A normal parent would have apologized and realized the magnitude of their terrible behavior. But Yolanda Brooks was not a normal parent. As the initial shock began to fade, her deeply ingrained entitlement rushed back in to protect her fragile ego. She squared her shoulders and marched toward the glass table, completely ignoring the reality of her situation. "This is a very sick joke," Valerie Yolanda snapped, slapping her bare hand against the glass tabletop. "You actually had us locked out of our own home just to prove some twisted point. You hired those actors in police uniforms to humiliate us in front of the entire neighborhood. Well, congratulations. You had your little power trip. Now pick up your phone and tell those people to let us back into our house." I did not move. I just looked at her. She honestly believed the federal authorities were actors. She was so desperate to maintain her delusion that she was rewriting reality right in front of me. "There are no actors, Yolanda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "The police officers were real. The asset recovery agents were real. The foreclosure is real. You do not own that house anymore." Richard stepped forward, standing next to his wife. He tried to puff out his chest and use his authoritative dad voice, but it cracked under the weight of his exhaustion. "Enough of this nonsense," Valerie Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "We are your parents. We gave you life. You do not get to play these corporate games with us. If you own this company, then you have the power to fix this immediately. I know you brought that gold box to the country club last night. I know you have a check in there. Take the check out of the box and pay off whatever ridiculous debt Connor allegedly owes so we can all go home." I leaned back in my leather chair. It was genuinely fascinating to watch them operate. They were completely broke, standing in my boardroom wearing sleepwear, and they were still trying to give me orders. They still viewed me as their subordinate. Monique pushed her way past our parents. Her face was red and puffy from crying. She slammed her hands on the table, leaning toward me with pure hatred in her eyes. "Connor is in a federal holding cell because of your stupid company, Valerie," she screamed. "He is your brother-in-law. You owe him a defense attorney and you owe him bail money right now. How could you do this to your own family?" I looked at Monique, taking in her ruined aesthetic. "Connor is in a federal holding cell because he ran a Ponzi scheme and forged our father's signature on a legal deed," I replied calmly. "He stole from our parents to fund his fake lifestyle. My company simply purchased the debt he defaulted on. I did not put him in jail. Monique, his own massive ego put him in jail. You demand that I fix your lives while you still refuse to acknowledge the damage you caused mine. You stand there in your silk pajamas demanding bail money for a man who packed his bags and tried to run away without his wife. Connor was fully prepared to leave you to deal with the federal investigators, Monique. He had a ticket to Switzerland in his bag. Yet here you are yelling at the only person who actually tried to warn you." Yolanda let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes as if I was just being a difficult teenager. "We do not care about the legal details, Valerie," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Family fixes things for family. I carried you in my womb for 9 months. Richard worked his entire life to provide a roof over your head. You owe us everything you have. You are going to clear this debt, and you are going to buy us a new car to make up for the emotional distress you caused us this morning." The sheer audacity of her demands hung heavy in the air. They were trying to gaslight me using the exact same toxic manipulation tactics they had used for the last 20 years. They wanted to use the concept of family as a blank check to fund their mistakes while entirely ignoring how terribly they had treated me. I picked up a sleek metal pen from the table and turned it slowly in my fingers. "You love using that word, family?" I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper that forced them to lean in to hear me. "But let us talk about how this family actually operates. 12 hours ago, I drove to the Belmont Country Club to give you a gift. I tried to hand you the solution to all your problems. And what did you do, Yolanda? You insulted my clothes. You told me I was not invited. And you, Richard, you swatted the gift out of my hands and told me to take my garbage back to the slums." Richard shifted uncomfortably on his bare feet, looking away from my piercing gaze. "That was different," he muttered weakly. "We were hosting an elite event. You know how important appearances are to us. You should have approached us privately." "Appearances?" I repeated, letting out a short, hollow laugh. "Appearances are exactly why you are standing in my office completely homeless. You wanted the appearance of wealth so badly that you let a white con artist drain your retirement accounts. You defended him because he looked the part. You threw me onto the street at 18 years old because I would not fund Monique's luxury car. You chose the aesthetic over the truth. You chose a fake son-in-law over your actual daughter. We are your blood! Yolanda shrieked, slamming her fist on the table again, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. You cannot abandon your blood. God will punish you for turning your back on your mother and father. I set the metal pen down on the glass table with a sharp click. The sound cut through her hysterical screaming like a knife. Blood simply means we share DNA, Yolanda. I replied, my voice absolute zero. It does not mean I am your personal ATM. It does not mean I have to sit here and let you abuse me while I clean up the catastrophic mess you made of your own lives. You came up here demanding respect and ordering me to open a box you threw on the floor last night. You still think you are in control. You still think you have leverage. You have absolutely nothing. I pressed a button on a small remote hidden under the edge of the table. The heavy motorized blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows began to slowly descend, darkening the massive boardroom. The sudden shift in lighting made the room feel even more imposing and claustrophobic. My parents and Monique backed away from the table slightly, their false bravado finally starting to crack under the immense weight of the reality they could no longer deny. They were trapped in my world now, and I was not going to let them leave until they understood exactly what they had thrown away. Richard stared at the heavy motorized blinds as they locked into place, plunging the room into a cool, shadowy dimness. He realized his attempts at parental authority were completely useless against the woman sitting at the head of the table. So he resorted to the only tactic he had left: blackmail. He placed his hands flat on the glass tabletop, leaning forward with a desperate, menacing glare. "You think you can just erase us, Valerie?" he growled, his voice echoing slightly in the large boardroom. "You think because your name is on the wall downstairs that you are untouchable? You are forgetting one very important detail. I know how the media works in this city. I have contacts at every major news station and newspaper." I raised a single eyebrow, waiting for him to play his pathetic hand. Richard took a deep breath, trying to steady his trembling frame. "How do you think it will look?" he continued, a cruel smirk creeping onto his face. "How do you think your wealthy investors will react when I go on television and tell the world that a highly successful black female CEO is violently evicting her elderly parents from their family home? I will tell them you left us to die on the streets without a single penny. I will tell them you are a heartless corporate monster who turned her back on her own community the second she got a taste of real money." Yolanda nodded vigorously beside him, suddenly finding a new wave of confidence. "That is exactly right, Richard," she chimed in, crossing her arms over her silk robe. "The church community will completely disown you, Valerie. We will make sure your name is absolute dirt. Nobody will want to do business with a woman who treats her own mother and father like disposable trash. The social backlash will ruin your little company." Yolanda leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "You have worked very hard to build this little empire of yours, Valerie," she hissed. "It would be a shame to see it all burn down because you were too stubborn to help your own flesh and blood. The black community in this city looks up to successful women like you. They expect you to lift your family up, not crush them under your designer heels. Think about the optics, Valerie. Think about how the narrative will destroy everything you have built." I looked at the two of them, marveling at the sheer, monumental scale of their audacity. They were standing in the ruins of a life they had destroyed with their own greed, and they were still trying to dig a deeper hole. They truly believed that my private equity firm, a multi-billion-dollar entity operating on a global scale, would crumble because of a local human interest story spun by two humiliated people in pajamas. Before I could even address the absurdity of my father's threat, Monique slammed her hands on the table again. She was not interested in the house or the media. Her delusion was entirely focused on the golden boy who had just abandoned her. "And what about Connor?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. The police officer told me his bail is going to be set at a minimum of $1 million. You are going to wire that money to the federal courthouse right now, Valerie. I slowly turned my gaze to my younger sister. I studied her tear-stained face and her messy hair. Monique, I said flatly. Your husband forged our father's signature to steal $1 million. He used that money to fund his fake lifestyle and buy a one-way ticket to Switzerland. He was running away from you. Why on earth would you want him out of jail? Because he is my husband, she screamed back, tears streaming down her face. He made a mistake. It was just a business deal that went bad and he panicked. He loves me, Valerie. He was going to send for me once he got settled in Europe. You just do not understand because nobody has ever loved you enough to marry you. You have always been bitterly jealous of what Connor and I have. You want to see him locked in a cage because it makes you feel powerful. The room fell dead silent after her outburst. The sheer density of her delusion was almost physical. She had constructed an entire fantasy narrative to protect her ego from the reality that she had married a con artist who viewed her and her family as nothing more than an easy payday. She was demanding that I, the sister she had relentlessly bullied and publicly smeared, pay $1 million to release the man who had just bankrupted her parents. You owe me this bail money. You owe it to our family, Monique sobbed, gripping the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles turned white. If you do not pay it, I will go to the media with Dad. I will tell them you fabricated the fraud charges to steal our house. I will tell everyone that you are a jealous, vindictive sociopath. I let out a slow, steady breath. The threats were flying from every direction. They were trying to corner a tiger with paper walls. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of public relations chess, but they did not even realize the board had already been flipped over. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass. My voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made them all freeze. You, Richard, intend to go to the press and tell them I evicted you. And you, Monique, intend to tell the press that I framed your husband for fraud. You want to use the court of public opinion to blackmail me into giving you back a house you legally lost and paying $1 million bail for a flight risk federal criminal. Richard stood a little taller, adjusting the collar of his burgundy pajama shirt. That is exactly right, he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its old arrogant rumble. We want the house back, and we want the bail money wired today. Do that, and we will keep our mouths shut. Refuse, and your precious reputation is completely finished. It was the absolute peak of entitlement. It was the defining moment of their toxic legacy. They were completely powerless, entirely at my mercy, and they were still demanding that I surrender. They had spent decades manipulating the narrative to make themselves look like the perfect, affluent family, and they believed they could manipulate reality one last time to save themselves from the consequences of their own actions. Optics. I repeated the word softly, tasting the bitter irony of it. You have spent your entire life worshipping optics, Yolanda. You sacrificed your relationship with your eldest daughter for the sake of an aesthetic. You let a criminal steal your retirement because he drove a nice car and looked like he belonged on Wall Street. And now you want to use optics to threaten me. I looked down at my hands for a brief moment, collecting my thoughts. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt an overwhelming sense of clinical satisfaction. They had played their final hand, and it was composed entirely of blank cards. They thought my reputation was built on the same fragile lies as theirs. They thought I feared the judgment of the church elders and the country club elite. I shook my head slowly, a genuine cold smile finally breaking across my face that made Richard instinctively take a half step back. They had no idea that I had already anticipated every single move they were going to make. I let out a laugh. It started quiet, a low chuckle in the back of my throat, and then it grew into a genuine loud laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the darkened boardroom. Richard, Monique, and Yolanda stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. Their threats of media exposure and social ruin were hanging heavily in the air, and I was sitting at the head of the table laughing directly in their faces. I stopped laughing and wiped a small tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. I raised my hand and signaled to my assistant, who had been standing silently in the corner this entire time. She stepped forward, holding something carefully in her hands. She placed it gently on the glass table directly in front of me and stepped back into the shadows. It was the gold-wrapped box. The shiny paper was torn, and the corner of the cardboard was still heavily crushed from where Richard had kicked it across the marble floor of the country club lobby. I placed my fingertips on the ruined gold paper and slowly pushed the box across the smooth glass surface of the boardroom table. The box made a quiet sliding sound until it came to a complete stop right in front of my father. "Open it," I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. "You wanted me to take the check out of the box, Richard. Why do you not do it yourself?" Richard looked down at the crushed package and then looked up at me. His chest puffed out slightly. He honestly believed he had won. He thought his desperate threats of going to the local news stations had successfully intimidated me into surrendering. He thought I was finally bending to his authority, just like I used to do when I was a scared teenager living under his roof. He reached out with his trembling hands and grabbed the box. He did not open it carefully. He ripped the gold paper apart, tearing it to shreds in his greedy desperation. Yolanda leaned in close, her eyes wide with anticipation, expecting to see a blank check or a briefcase full of $100 bills. Monique stopped crying completely, waiting for the money that would bail out her criminal husband. Richard pulled off the damaged cardboard lid and threw it aside. He reached inside the box and pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. There was no check. There was no cash. He stared at the top page, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Across the top of the first page, printed in massive bold red ink, was the word void. Underneath it, stamped heavily across the dense legal text, was the word expired. "What is this?" Richard demanded, flipping through the pages frantically, his eyes darting across the legal jargon. "Where is the money, Valerie? What are these contracts?" I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers together. "Those contracts, Richard, were your absolute salvation," I explained slowly, letting every single word sink deep into their brains. "Those documents were a legally binding amnesty agreement, drafted by my top corporate attorneys." The boardroom was dead silent, except for the sound of Richard frantically turning the heavy pages. "If you had opened that box last night, you would have seen that my private equity firm had already prepared the paperwork to entirely wipe out the $1.2 million debt Connor owed," I said. "The contract would have completely released the lien on your house. It would have given you full ownership of your estate, free and clear forever. All you had to do was sign your name on the dotted line." Yolanda's mouth dropped open. She looked from the papers to me and back to the papers. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale under the dim lights. "You mean," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, "you mean the house could have been saved?" "It was saved, Yolanda," I replied, my voice absolute zero. "I brought that box to your anniversary party to save you. Despite everything you have ever done to me, I walked into that country club ready to hand you your entire legacy back. But you decided my dress was too cheap. Richard decided my presence was too embarrassing. You threw the only life raft you had onto the marble floor and told me to take a cab back to the slums." Richard kept staring at the red expired stamp. His hands shaking so violently, the heavy papers rustled loudly in the quiet room. "But we have it right now," he said, his voice cracking with desperate panic. "We can sign it right now, Valerie. Give me a pen. I will sign it right here on the table and we can forget this ever happened." I shook my head slowly, enjoying the sheer terror in his eyes. "You cannot sign it now, Richard. Look at the fine print at the very bottom of the page." Richard squinted, reading the tiny text at the bottom of the document. His face turned a sickening shade of gray. Monique reached over and snatched one of the voided pages from his hand, reading it for herself. "The amnesty offer had a strict expiration clause," I said, perfectly level. "It expired exactly at 12:00 a.m. last night. Midnight." The exact same moment the offer expired, the hostile foreclosure automatically triggered. The bank executed the seizure and the federal authorities were notified of Connor's fraud. I want you to think about what you were doing at midnight last night. Yolanda, I continued, turning my cold gaze to my mother. You were standing in the country club drinking expensive champagne and laughing with your elite friends about how successfully you had kicked your disappointment of a daughter out of your party. Monique, you were sitting in a leased Mercedes crying fake tears on an internet live stream to turn the church congregation against me. And Connor was probably packing his duffel bag with your retirement cash to flee the country. Monique dropped the paper onto the glass table. She realized that her own sister had held the absolute power to keep her husband out of federal prison, and she had blown it by choosing to mock me on social media. You were all so busy celebrating your fake superiority that you did not even realize the clock had struck midnight on your entire lives. I said the cold truth ringing through the boardroom. You did not lose your house because of a clerical error. You did not lose your house because I am a heartless corporate monster. You lost everything because you were too arrogant to accept a gift from someone you considered beneath you. Richard dropped the rest of the voided contracts onto the glass table as if they physically burned his hands. He stumbled backward, hitting his knees against the leather chair behind him, and collapsed into it. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, guttural sob that sounded like a dying animal. It was the sound of a man who had spent 65 years building a fragile ego, only to watch it shatter into a million irreversible pieces. Yolanda stared at the crushed gold paper scattered across the glass table. Her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. The delusion was finally broken completely. There was no invisible social status left to protect her. There was no mayor or judge who could turn back the clock. She had literally held the keys to her mansion in her own hands, and she had swatted them away because the wrapping paper did not fit her aesthetic. I watched them break. I watched the crushing weight of their own terrible choices finally squeeze the breath out of them. They had demanded I open the box and fix their lives, but the only thing inside that box was the brutal reflection of their own toxic pride. There was no media threat or blackmail material in the world that could change the undeniable fact that they had done this completely to themselves. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my father's ragged breathing. I let them sit in that crushing realization for a long moment before I turned my attention back to my younger sister. Monique was still clutching the edge of the table, staring blankly at the voided contracts. Her mind was desperately trying to cling to the last remaining pillar of her identity, her husband. Her entire sense of superiority was built on the fact that she had married a wealthy white financial expert while I was supposedly just a bitter failure. I nodded to my assistant again. She stepped forward and handed me a thick, heavy manila folder. I did not slide this one gently. I tossed the heavy dossier onto the glass table where it landed with a loud, sharp smack right in front of Monique. "Open it, Monique," I commanded. "You wanted to talk about your husband. You wanted me to pay $1 million to bail out the love of your life. You stood there in your silk pajamas and told me that he loved you and that he was just a victim of a bad business deal. Let us take a very close look at the man you brought into this family." Monique's hands trembled as she reached for the folder. She flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The first page was a comprehensive financial timeline mapped out by my investigative team. "Connor never worked on Wall Street, Monique," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. "He was a mid-level accountant who got fired 3 years ago for embezzlement. The entire time you were married, he was running a localized Ponzi scheme. He used our parents' retirement money to pay off his initial angry investors just to keep up the illusion. He bought you that designer wardrobe, and he leased that Mercedes, using money he stole directly from the two people sitting next to you." Monique shook her head in furious denial, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "No," she whispered. "He is a financial expert. Dad said so. Dad checked his credentials before we got married." I looked at Richard. Richard looked away, unable to meet his youngest daughter's eyes. He had not checked anything. He had just seen a tall white man in a custom-tailored suit who spoke with unearned confidence and blindly handed over his life savings. He wanted a trophy son-in-law so badly that he ignored every single red flag. Turn to page 4. Monique, I instructed, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Monique flipped the pages with shaking fingers. She stared at printed screenshots of text messages. I had my cybersecurity team recover those messages from the servers of his shadow lenders, I explained. Read them out loud, Monique. Read what your loving husband really thought about the family you destroyed me to protect. Monique opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was physically unable to read the words. She just stared at the screen, grabs her face turning a sickening shade of pale. So I read them for her. The message sent on October 12th to his associate reads as follows. I recited from memory, looking directly at my parents. You would not believe how easy this is. My black-in-laws are so incredibly gullible. They are so desperate to be accepted by the white country club elite that they do not ask a single question. Richard practically hands me his bank statements on a silver platter just so he can brag about me at his church. They are pathetic. I will have the house deed transferred by Friday. Yolanda let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Richard closed his eyes, a fresh wave of utter humiliation washing over his exhausted face. The golden boy they had worshipped, the man they had used to justify throwing me away, had viewed them as nothing more than foolish, easy targets. Their own internalized racism, their desperate need for proximity to whiteness and status, had blinded them to a predator living right under their roof. They had demanded that I respect him. They had demanded that I apologize to him last night, and the entire time he was laughing at them behind their backs. But that is not even the best part, I said, leaning forward and resting my arms on the cool glass table. Turn to the very last page of the dossier, Monique. Monique slowly turned the heavy pages, her tears dropping heavily onto the paper and smearing the ink. It was a printout of a flight itinerary. Your husband was not planning to send for you once he got settled in Europe, I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow to her delusion. Look at the ticket, Monique. It is a one-way first-class ticket to Zurich, Switzerland, scheduled to depart this morning at 9:30. Monique stared at the single-passenger name printed clearly on the itinerary. Connor Hayes. Just one seat. Just one ticket. He packed his leather duffel bag with all the stolen cash he could carry, and he ran for the airport. I continued, refusing to look away from her broken expression. He was going to leave you here, Monique. He was going to leave you holding the bag for $1 million in federal fraud. He used you to get access to our parents' wealth, and the second the well dried up, he discarded you like absolute garbage. He did not love you. You were just the easiest mark he ever found. The final shred of Monique's fake reality completely dissolved. The aesthetic she had murdered her own character to maintain was officially dead. She let out a scream that was so loud and full of pure visceral agony that it echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. She grabbed the edges of the heavy folder and threw it across the table, sending the damning papers flying everywhere. She fell forward, hitting her head against the cool glass table, sobbing with such violent force that her entire body shook. Her perfect marriage was a calculated financial crime. Her beautiful elite life was funded by the total destruction of her own parents. She had spent her entire life mocking me for being a failure while she was sleeping next to a man who was actively planning to ruin her. Richard reached out a trembling hand to put on her shoulder, but she violently pushed him away. "Do not touch me!" she screamed, her voice cracking and raw. "You let him do this! You told me he was perfect! You gave him everything!" Yolanda just sat there, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic damage playing out in front of her. She could not blame me anymore. She could not blame a clerical error. The evidence was scattered all over the boardroom table in black and white. They had sacrificed their real daughter for a fake son, and now the bill had finally come due. The truth was entirely exposed, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. Monique's sobs filled the large boardroom, echoing off the thick glass windows. Richard was still slumped in his leather chair, staring blankly at the scattered papers that proved his entire life was a lie. Yolanda, however, was slowly starting to process the reality of their situation. Her eyes shifted from the crying Monique back to me. I could see the gears turning in her head again. She was a survivor in the most toxic sense of the word. Even at absolute rock bottom, she was looking for a loophole. Valerie, she said, her voice shaking but carrying a new desperate tone. Okay, Connor is a criminal. We were wrong about him. We admit it. But the house, Valerie, the bank took the house. Banks want money, not real estate. If your company bought the debt, then your company can negotiate with the bank. We can set up a payment plan. Richard can come out of retirement. We can sell the cars. Just please, you have to let us back into our home. We cannot be homeless. I looked at my mother and felt a deep, profound sense of finality. She still did not understand the magnitude of what had happened at midnight. She still thought this was a standard banking error that could be fixed with a few phone calls and a payment plan. Yolanda, I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands in my lap. There is no bank left to negotiate with. Richard slowly lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. What do you mean there is no bank? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. When a property is foreclosed upon, it usually goes to a public auction, I explained, keeping my voice slow and deliberate so they would not miss a single word. But V Apex Holdings is not just a debt collection agency. We are a private equity firm with massive liquid capital. We did not just trigger the default. We executed the foreclosure and we immediately purchased the property deed directly from the holding company, the very second it became available this morning. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a long moment, before delivering the ultimate bombshell. I am not just your debt collector, I said, looking directly into my father's eyes. I am your new landlord. I personally own the estate. The deed is entirely in my name. Richard gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. You own the house? He repeated the words, tasting like poison in his mouth. You own my house. It is not your house anymore, Richard, I corrected him softly. It is my property. The very same property you kicked me out of 16 years ago. You handed me a garbage bag and told me I was a worthless burden because I would not hand over my minimum wage paychecks. You told me I would never amount to anything and that I was no longer welcome under your roof. Well, it is my roof now. Yolanda stood up from her chair, her silk robe slipping off her shoulder. Her eyes were wide with a sudden frantic hope. Then you can let us stay, she pleaded, taking a step toward the glass table. Valerie, you own it. You can just let us move back in. We will pay you rent. We will do whatever you want. You can have the master bedroom. You have made your point. You have humbled us. Just please give us our home back. I looked at her frantic, desperate face and felt absolutely nothing. There was no maternal bond left to salvage. There was no family legacy to protect. There was only the cold, hard truth of consequences. I am not going to rent it to you, Yolanda, I said plainly. And I am certainly not going to live in it. I have a $5 million penthouse that does not reek of toxic memories and fake prestige. Then what are you going to do with it? Richard asked, a deep sense of dread creeping into his voice. It is a historical colonial estate. It is worth millions. You are a businesswoman. You are going to sell it. I shook my head slowly, a genuine smile touching the corners of my mouth. I am not going to sell it either. I reached into the inside pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. It was not a heavy legal document or a voided contract. It was a very simple, brightly colored form issued by the city zoning department. I placed it gently on the glass table and slid it toward them. Richard leaned forward and looked at the paper. His eyes widened and his breath hitched in his throat. That is a municipal demolition permit, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority. Approved and stamped by the city council yesterday afternoon. Next Tuesday, at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a crew of bulldozers and heavy excavators are going to roll onto that pristine, manicured lawn. They are going to tear down the grand mahogany doors. They are going to smash the crystal chandeliers, and they are going to crush those white historical columns into dust. I am going to flatten that house until there is nothing left but dirt. Yolanda let out a piercing scream. No! She shrieked, grabbing her hair. No, you cannot do that. It is our legacy. It is the most beautiful house in the neighborhood. You cannot destroy it. I am not destroying anything, Yolanda. I am building something better, I replied calmly. That house was a monument to your arrogance. It was a status symbol that you worshipped more than your own children. It was a fortress of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. So I am going to wipe it off the map. Monique stopped crying and stared at me in pure horror. What are you going to build? She whispered, her voice trembling. Once the land is cleared, my firm is funding the construction of a state-of-the-art transitional shelter for women escaping financial abuse, I announced. It will provide housing, legal resources, and job training for women who have been controlled, manipulated, and discarded by toxic partners or family members. Women who were thrown out onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag. I let the weight of that reality sink in. I am going to name the shelter after myself, I continued. It will be a permanent fixture in your elite neighborhood. Imagine it, Yolanda. Every single day, Mrs. Carmichael and Mr. Henderson will have to drive their luxury cars past a massive charity shelter built directly on top of the Brooks family legacy. They will have to look at my name on the building, and they will remember that you lost everything because you let a white con artist drain your accounts. You cared so much about what those snobs thought of you. And now they will be forced to look at your ultimate failure every single day for the rest of their lives. Richard completely collapsed inward. He buried his face in his hands again, weeping openly. The destruction was absolute. Not only had he lost his wealth, his status, and his golden son-in-law, but the very physical structure he had used to measure his self-worth was going to be violently erased from existence. The aesthetic was dead. The legacy was pulverized. The universe had finally balanced the scales, and the weight of it was breaking them in half. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of Richard's weeping. Monique slowly looked up from the scattered papers, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The reality of her situation had finally crushed the last remaining wall of her ego. She had no house, she had no husband, she had no money, and her entire elite social circle was going to find out she was married to a ruthless fraud. She looked at me sitting perfectly still at the head of the massive glass table in my tailored charcoal suit. She realized in that exact moment that I was the only person left in the world who could save her from complete ruin. Monique slid out of her black leather chair. Her legs simply gave out, and she dropped hard onto her knees right on the pristine carpet of my corporate boardroom. She crawled forward slightly, reaching her trembling hands out to grab the hem of my suit pants. "Valerie, please," she begged, her voice a raspy, pathetic whisper that echoed in the dim room. "I have absolutely nothing left. Connor took all the money from my joint accounts before he ran. He even took the emergency cash from my hidden safe. I do not know how to pay for a divorce lawyer. I do not even know how to buy groceries tomorrow. Please let me work for you." I stared down at the sister who had made my childhood a living hell. The golden child who had mocked my clothes and my job was now literally groveling at my feet. "I will do anything," Valerie Monique sobbed, gripping the fabric of my pants with her manicured nails. "I will be your personal assistant. I will fetch your coffee. I will scrub the marble floors of this building every single night. Just please give me a job. Give me a salary so I do not have to sleep on the street in my pajamas. I am your little sister. You have to help me survive this." I slowly reached down and peeled her desperate fingers off my clothing one by one. I pushed my ergonomic chair back, distancing myself entirely from her pathetic display. "I cannot hire you, Monique," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the shadows. "My private equity firm has very strict hiring standards. We manage billions of dollars in assets. We only employ individuals with absolute integrity and verifiable academic credentials." "I have a degree?" Monique stammered, desperately wiping the mascara-stained tears from her swollen cheeks. "I have a degree in business communications. Dad paid for my tuition. You know I went to college, Valerie. I am educated." I shook my head slowly, resting my elbows on the armrests of my chair. You did not go to college. Monique, you went to campus parties. You failed out of your sophomore year because you were too busy trying to maintain your wealthy socialite aesthetic for Instagram. When Dad demanded to see your diploma for his country club bragging rights, you panicked. You went online, and you paid $400 to a fake diploma mill based in southern Florida to print a completely fraudulent piece of paper. You even paid an extra $50 for the fake gold foil university seal. Monique's jaw dropped, her tear-filled eyes widening in absolute terror. Richard stopped crying and lifted his heavy head, staring at his youngest daughter in pure shock. Yolanda let out a weak, sickening gasp. Yes, I know about the fake degree. I continued, perfectly calm and completely unbothered by their horror. My corporate background check team ran a standard deep audit on you months ago when Connor's illegal activities first popped up on our radar. Your entire life is a manufactured lie, Monique. Your marriage was a scam, your degree is a fraud, and your luxury lifestyle was stolen directly from the parents you are kneeling next to right now. I would not hire you to empty the trash cans in this building because you are a liability to everything you touch. Monique collapsed, completely laying flat on the carpet and wailing into the floor. She was entirely broken. Her identity was completely pulverized. Yolanda could not take it anymore. The absolute destruction of her golden child was too much for her fragile narcissistic mind to process. She stood up, her sheer silk robe trembling around her thin frame. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and decided to try one last tactic. The sacred maternal bond. She walked slowly around the massive glass table, stepping right over Monique's crying body. She opened her arms wide, tears streaming rapidly down her aging face. My sweet daughter, Yolanda cried, her voice dripping with fake, overwhelming emotion. My brilliant, beautiful Valerie, I am so incredibly sorry. We were so blind, we were so foolish to trust that awful white man. But you are so strong, Valerie. You survived our mistakes, and you built all of this beautiful wealth. Please, my sweet daughter, let me hug you. Let us heal this broken family. Right now, we love you so much. She lunged forward, trying to wrap her arms around my neck, trying to pull me into a toxic embrace that would somehow magically erase 2 decades of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. I stood up instantly, kicking my heavy chair back and taking a large, deliberate step away from her. Do not touch me, I ordered, my voice slicing through the boardroom like a physical weapon. Yolanda froze instantly, her arms suspended awkwardly in the empty air, her face crumbling in brutal rejection. You do not get to call me your sweet daughter, I said, staring directly into her terrified, panicked eyes. You do not get to claim my success after you spent my entire life actively trying to destroy my self-worth. You want to know what I remember right now? Yolanda, I remember a freezing cold night in December 16 years ago. I remember standing in the hallway shivering while you shoved a cheap black plastic garbage bag into my chest. Yolanda shook her head desperately, backing away toward the windows. No, please, Valerie, do not say it. She whimpered, knowing exactly what was coming. I stepped toward her, forcing her to look at my face. I am going to tell you exactly what you told me that night. I said, my voice low, absolute, and utterly merciless. You are a worthless burden. You are a disgusting stain on this family aesthetic. Pack your cheap garbage and get out of my sight because you are no longer welcome under my roof. Yolanda let out a broken, soul-crushing sob, collapsing against the thick glass window. The power dynamic was officially and permanently destroyed. I had taken her toxic, hateful words and handed them right back to her, sealing her fate forever. I pressed the intercom button on my sleek wooden desk without taking my eyes off the pathetic scene unfolding in front of me. Security, please come up to the executive boardroom immediately, I instructed calmly. We have 3 trespassers who need to be escorted off the premises right now. Richard tried to stand up, his knees shaking violently under the immense weight of his ruined life. Valerie, please, he begged, holding his empty hands up in total surrender. We have no money for a cab. We have no cell phones that work. We do not even have shoes on our feet. You cannot just throw us out onto the downtown sidewalk in our pajamas. I crossed my arms over my chest. You can walk, Richard, I replied coldly. The fresh air will give you plenty of time to think about your precious legacy. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime. 4 massive security guards wearing immaculate black suits stepped into the room. They moved with silent military precision, quickly surrounding my parents and my crying sister. Monique tried to fight back, weakly swatting at the guards' hands, but they effortlessly hauled her to her feet by her upper arms. Yolanda was completely catatonic, staring blankly at the floor as a guard gently but firmly guided her toward the exit. Richard walked with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in total absolute defeat. They were pushed into the elevator, the steel doors closing on their terrified, humiliated faces. I walked over to my desk and opened the security camera feeds on my large monitor, watching their descent. They rode down 60 floors in complete agonizing silence. They looked like ghosts, hollowed-out shells of the arrogant, entitled people who had walked into the country club just last night. When the elevator reached the grand lobby, the guards marched them straight past the reception desk. Sarah, the receptionist, did not even look up from her computer screen as they passed. They were pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. But the public humiliation was not over yet. The second they stumbled into the bright morning sunlight, a sea of blinding white camera flashes erupted directly in their faces. I had made a few anonymous phone calls to aggressive local investigative journalists earlier that morning, tipping them off about a massive federal Ponzi scheme arrest linked to the prominent Brooks family. The local press was incredibly hungry for a high society scandal, and I had served my fake family up on a silver platter. Reporters shoved thick microphones into Richard's face, shouting rapid questions over the loud noise of the city traffic. "Mr. Brooks, is it true? Your son-in-law stole millions from your church community?" They yelled. "Mrs. Brooks, are you aware? Connor Hayes forged your property deeds to fund his escape to Switzerland today." "Monique, did you know your husband was a federal criminal when you married him?" The rapid camera flashes blinded them completely. Richard tried to shield his face with his bare, trembling hands, pushing blindly through the aggressive crowd. Yolanda completely broke down, sobbing hysterically on the dirty pavement, while television cameras recorded every single humiliating second of her public collapse. Monique just stood there, frozen in the flashing lights, a terrified deer in the headlights of her own ruined aesthetic. They were completely exposed, stripped of their fake wealth and their toxic pride, broadcast live for all their elite country club friends to watch on the morning news. I turned off the monitor and walked away from the wooden desk. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The sun was incredibly bright. The sky was a clear, piercing blue, and the heavy toxic weight that I had carried in my chest for 16 long years was completely, entirely gone. My assistant quietly entered the room holding a delicate porcelain cup on a small silver saucer. She walked over and handed it to me with a warm, respectful smile. "Chamomile tea with a drop of honey, boss," she said softly. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, taking the warm cup into my hands. She nodded and left the room, closing the heavy door gently behind her. I took a slow, deep sip of the tea, letting the sweet, comforting warmth spread through my entire body. I looked down at the tiny figures on the sidewalk far below me, completely surrounded by the relentless media swarm. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. They tell us that we have to forgive and forget, because family is everything. They tell us to keep the peace, to swallow our pain, and to set ourselves on fire just to keep our toxic relatives warm. But they are entirely wrong. Blood simply means you share a random genetic code. It does not mean you owe your abusers a lifetime of unrestricted access to your peace of mind. Cutting off a toxic bloodline is the most painful emotional surgery you will ever perform on yourself, but it is absolutely necessary for your ultimate survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You cannot build a massive empire while carrying the heavy dead weight of people who constantly pray for your downfall. My parents wanted me to stay small so they could feel big. They wanted me to fail so their golden child could shine brighter by comparison. But the exact moment I stopped seeking their conditional, fake approval, I became completely unstoppable. The greatest revenge you can ever take on narcissistic family members is not yelling at them or trying to explain your deep pain. It is simply walking away and building a life so incredibly successful and peaceful that their permanent absence is not even a loss. It is an absolute glorious upgrade. I took another slow sip of my tea, watching the crowd below slowly disperse, leaving my family standing entire